Were you missold student loans? Probably. All good? Okay. Were you missold your student loan? There is actually an MP in the House of Commons that has said that the student loan controversy might be the mis-selling scandal of the century. So why are student loans back in the spotlight? Many of us have been saying for years that this was a problem, but for some reason, the news has specifically picked it up, MPs are picking it up, and it has snowballed. I think that one of the first places to start is the Rethink Repayment campaign headed up by Ollie Gardner. He has been campaigning about this for a long time. I've been talking about student loans for a long time with the students I teach and with you, and there are so many other young people that are in this position right now with Plan 2 loans that are genuinely furious about this and want this to be talked about more. As someone that went to university in 2012, so I was the first year that the student loan went from $3,000 a year to $9,000 a year, I looked up my student loan the other day and it's around $50,000 plus, and I have been paying that off for well over 10 years. It is ridiculous. I am going to talk about today everything from how you find out how much student loan you have left, what the interest is, how you repay it, what's been going on in the news, what certain MPs think should be happening, is university still worth it, and finally, practical takeaways for you to remember when it comes to your student loan. Hey, I'm Abby Foster. I am a chartered accountant and I teach finance online. I also founded a company that teaches finance in schools, and I am so lucky to say that I go into loads of schools every week and teach finance to all years. But I will say specifically, when I am teaching year 12 and year 13, even year 11, I am really adamant to talk about student loans because it was something that was definitely missold to me, and I just don't want it to happen to the next generation. So let's start with the basics. What is the student loan? The student loan is made up of the tuition loan and the maintenance loan. The tuition loan currently stands at around $9,250. Back when I went, it was a flat $9,000. It's been slowly rising. The maintenance loan is a spectrum depending on how much maintenance you're entitled to. The less family income you have, the more maintenance loan you can take out, and vice versa. What happens after university finishes is it collects into one number, because during uni, the tuition goes straight to a university provider, the maintenance goes to you. But after university, that collects into one number, and that is your university loan that you will start paying back the April after you finish. Key to remember, if you are paying back any of your student loan before then, you are entitled to a refund. So let's say that you finished in May 2025, you won't be paying any of that student loan off until at least April 2026, regardless of how much income you're earning. The repayment threshold for Plan 2, so that's specifically for people that went to uni between 2012 and 2023, which this video is about, is $28,470. What that means is once you earn above that, you pay 9% above $28,470. So if you're on £30,000, you take your 30, less your $28,470 and times that by 9%, divide by 12 months gives you the monthly contributions you would be making. And back when I was at school, we were told that it would be no more than a phone bill. It would be such a small amount you won't even notice. But the more you earn, the more you definitely do notice. And what's happening now is we're seeing more of those people in that Plan 2 student loan obviously getting later on into their career, so they're getting into their 30s now and seeing their income rise, but also these massive deductions coming out of their pay slips for student loans. So if you were on £100,000, which go you would literally take 100,000 minus 28,470 times by 9%, gives you 6,437, divided by the 12 months would mean around 536 or £537 of contributions every single month. That is literally tax. We are increasing the tax paid on our payslip by 9%. So what is happening, and something I'm going to get into later, is it's actually discouraging growth, because the more people earn, they're realizing that such a large amount of it gets taken away that it might not even be worth it. And that threshold of 28,470 used to be, up until last year, 27,295. Before that, it was even lower, and before that. So it is meant to rise with inflation. However, fiscal drag, which we have talked about before, comes into play because Rachel Reeves in the last budget froze the allowance of 28,470 for at least 3+ years. So what you're going to see is obviously as wages rise, or you hope wages rise, the amount that threshold has risen by won't be matching that at all. It will be staying the same, and so therefore you'll pay more tax, or more of that 9% in between. So who actually owns the student loan? Well, it's owned by the Student Loans Company, which is roughly 85% owned by the government and then a mixture of some private companies as well. It's important to be clear that the debt is owned by the government, but some repayment rights were sold off to private companies. So for many people, you do repay through the tax system, be that through self-assessment or PAYE, which is the most common, i.e. it comes out of your payslip. And these rules are set by the government, they're not set by a private company. ChatGPT, I wrote like a load of notes and then I asked it to like coordinate them into like a really good, like easy to read and with like a purpose and point. And the purpose on point 3 is, explain why people feel misled, but try to do this without ranting. I haven't told it that I was ranting, but thanks for that. Okay, right. This is where we get to the political bit. This is how politics has impacted our finances. Back in the David Cameron, Nick Clegg era, where we had a Lib Dem Conservative coalition, there was uproar because Nick Clegg was coming in and saying, I'm not going to let them increase student fees. If anything, they were saying we want to get rid of them. And then suddenly they came together and we then had this huge jump from 3K to 9K. There were marches, there were loads of conversations happening at the time about how unfair this was. But I don't remember anyone really saying to me, yes, it's going up, but be careful about the interest rate. We were constantly being told that the interest rate was in line with inflation, or, well, we weren't told that because I don't remember ever when I was like 16 probably knowing what the word inflation was, but we were told that the value of the student loan would just rise with the value of money. And to me, I was like, oh, that's fine then, because my money will also rise. How little did I know? So obviously, we had Nick Clegg and David Cameron obviously coming in and jumping it up to 9,000. But what had also come before is Tony Blair's conversations around students going to university. The main reason he wanted to drive up people going to university was to actually bring down unemployment figures, because if you were in university or in further education, you're not unemployed. And so what it did is it helped reduce the unemployment figure. This was kind of artificial because obviously it just meant that you were in education, but you weren't earning. So anyway, then if you collect all of that together, you had huge amounts of people going to university alongside schools that suddenly had these metrics where they were trying to drive everyone to university to hit this metrics of a percentage of students that they had in their school going to university. So all of those things combined led to huge amounts of students going to university, huge amounts of money being borrowed by the Student Loans Company, and now we're here in 2026, where we are discussing whether actually the entire thing was missold, and definitely there was a ton of miseducation around it. There is some debate as to whether students should just take out a loan, a general debt, instead of the student loan debt, because technically the interest rate might be lower than the 6.2% right now, let's say. However, some things to remember when it comes to the student loan debt is that if you earn below 28,470, you stop paying. So if you don't earn enough money, you don't repay the debt, which doesn't happen with any traditional debt. Also, the interest does keep growing, so just remember that. It's just at RPI as opposed to RPI up to 3%. Also, unlike any other loan, for Plan 2, after 30 years after you finish university, the loan gets wiped. That is completely unique to student loans. You may be in the camp where you think, well, I didn't go to university, and university does cost more than the £9,250 or whatever that we pay for tuition loan. And so a large proportion of that income or that amount of costs to the university will end up on the taxpayer. So maybe it should be fair that student loans have to pay, or students in general have to pay student loan back and the interest is incurred. But realistically, if you're looking at £15.2 billion worth of interest and only £5 billion of that is repaid, surely there's something to be said that we should cap the interest or lower the 9% rate, or I don't know, just at least keep the threshold rising with inflation. I don't know, it just feels like there's some real mis-selling, and actually not necessarily the teachers, because I know they were doing just the best they could, but maybe someone along the way, Tony Blair, Nick Clegg, David Cameron, have something to answer to when it comes to how much of us are now being hit with such a huge knock on our pay slips every month. I don't know. I could be wrong. What do you think? If you cut to 2025, politics is still getting involved. Obviously, I spoke already about the fact that Rachel Reeves froze the threshold of 28,470. Is it legal for her to retrospectively change something that we took out in 2012? I don't really know, But that is what's happening. The 9% fee might not be moving and the interest rate may not have changed, but if you touch that threshold, it is going to impact people today. I spoke about at the top of the video how you repay, so it's at 9% over the threshold. But what's really important is the interest rate, and that is what we're all talking about right now. And this is how it works. Right now, if you're on plan 2, the interest rate is between RPI up to RPI plus 3. It's a bit confusing because usually we just kind of have a blanket statement of the interest rate being RPI plus 3. So between 0 and 28,470, the interest is RPI, so we'll just grow with interest. This is based on how much you earn, by the way, so it's a spectrum based on how much you earn. Then between 28,000 and around 51,000, it goes up in stages. So it can go up by 1%, 2%, up to 3%. And then around 51,000, it starts to just become RPI plus 3%. RPI is already an outdated metric. It's usually around 1% higher than the CPI metric we use to measure inflation. So you're looking at around 3.2% for just RPI. You add another 3% onto that, you're looking at 6.2% interest. And as you may remember, back in October of 2022, we had interest rates of 11.1%, which no one was envisaging. Everyone thought that the interest rate being linked to inflation would mean it would be very low and never drive up. But inflation rose, and therefore the interest on our student loans rose, and it caused huge ripple effects that we're seeing now. Wilfred Ross and Sophie Ridge do a morning show on Sky News, and he actually had a graph that I'm going to put up on the screen here where he showed how interest on the student loan has been going over the last 10 plus years. And you can see that the principal and the interest sit very closely together, except from the last 2 years when the interest has overshot the principal by a huge amount. And this is a ripple-on impact from those high interest rates in the last few years. And what we saw last year was interest on student loans alone hit 15.2 billion, yet only 5 billion of that was actually repaid. So what we've learned from here is that not only do higher earners pay more, they actually charge more interest. We're also seeing the principal be seriously below the interest, which is ridiculous. So many students, including myself, look at their student loan statement and say, okay, I've been paying this off for 10 years, surely it should have gone down. And then they look at it and go, no, if anything, it's gone up. So speaking of looking into your student loan, this is how you look into how much student loan you have left. If you type in student finance login, there is a Gov website that will help direct you to that login, and I'll bring it up here. So what you do is you can put in your email or your number and then your password. If you've forgotten it, don't worry. It's a very easy process. You just put in your email. If you've really forgotten even the email you use, you put in your name, your date of birth, and it will spit out the email that you used, and then you can do forgot password. Once you're in, you want to view your statement. Obviously, the big number at the top will be how much student loan you've got left. But if you view your statement, you'll be able to see the principal and the interest that's being carried and what's going on there as well. It's really important that you do. It can upset many people. It upset me, but it's worth knowing and understanding how much you've got left, because you may be one of the lucky ones, especially if you're watching this and you're on plan 1. You might be one of those people that looks in and realizes you don't have much to pay off because you borrowed less. And therefore you want to keep an eye and make sure you're not overpaying the student loan after you've finished repaying it. But if you're on plan 2, chances are that student loan is going to be chunky. Last week, I interviewed 3 people, 2 MPs and 1 campaign manager. So Ollie Gardner, who I talked about right at the beginning of the show, he is the campaign lead for Rethink Repayment. And here is what he had to say.
I'm Ollie Gardner. I founded a campaign called Rethink Repayment, which is arguing for a fairer student loan repayment system for graduates in the UK.
Ollie, can you explain how student loans were originally designed and why you believe the system no longer works as intended?
Yeah, so when tuition fees really started to become substantial, the government realised that people couldn't afford to pay them up front. And so they had to introduce income contingent loans, which means basically that people start paying back their student loans once they start earning above a certain amount. And that obviously became really important around 2012 when tuition fees were tripled from £3,000 to £9,000 a year. And I think the idea was that this was going to, open up access to university because you didn't need to pay your fees up front, and therefore people from less advantaged backgrounds would go to university. But in reality, what this has now left people with are huge amounts of debt, right? So people have, 3 years of tuition fees at £9,000. They have maintenance loans added on top of that. But the thing that's made this sort of really, really punitive, particularly for those with Plan 2 loans, but also people with Plan 1 loans and Plan 5 loans, are the high interest rates that are charged on student loans, which means that their balance balloons after and actually even during their period of study.
So you believe that the fundamental problem with student loans currently is the interest alone?
I don't think that's the only issue. I think the interest being added really substantially is a major issue for student loans because it means that many graduates who are making consistent repayments every month as they're required to actually see their student loan balance increasing every year. So despite making repayments, the balance for some people is going up. It's like a huge amount. So I've got a friend who's a junior doctor. He made £1,500 in repayments for his student loan last year, and £6,500 of interest was added. So his loan balance increased by £5,000, even though he was making repayments. So that is a really significant issue. But the other thing about student loans, or one of the other issues, is that effectively it leaves graduates with a 9% higher marginal tax rate than people without a student loan. Because for everything you earn above the threshold, so about £28,000 for Plan 2, £25,000 for people with the newer Plan 5 loans, you pay 9% of that income back to your student loan. So that means that if you're a higher rate taxpayer who has a undergraduate student loan, you have a marginal tax rate of 51%, which means you're keeping less than 50p of every extra pound that you earn. And we need to think about what that's doing to economic incentives and people's incentives to work, because we've spoken to people like doctors who are actually turning down overtime shifts because they just don't think it's worth their while financially because they keep such a small proportion or less than half of every extra pound that they earn.
Ollie, there is a specific salary, right? At which point you are paying off not only the interest but also the principal.
Yeah, so this obviously depends on the size of your loan. But if you take the average loan that people are leaving university with now, which is £53,000, which, by the way, is 4 to 5 times higher than people were leaving with in 2009. But if you take that balance of £53,000, you need to be earning on a Plan 2 loan about £65,000 before your repayments are greater than the interest added. So over £65,000 you need to be earning in order for your balance to actually go down each year.
We've talked about all the issues. What would you want to be fixed? What are the problems you're seeing and how would you fix them?
Yeah, so there are lots of problems with the student loan system, but I think we're focusing on two of the main ones, which are the really high interest that's being applied, which makes loads of graduates feel that then there's never realistically a prospect of them paying it back, which is really unfair, particularly when some people might end up paying back twice the amount that they actually borrowed initially. So we think there definitely needs to be a cap on interest that can be charged on student loans. Remember, these were loans that young people were effectively told they had to take out if they wanted to go to university, unless they had parents rich enough basically to pay their tuition fee loans. And they had to take them out in order to compete for good jobs, as they were told. So these are loans for an education that they were told that they had to take out. We shouldn't have really, really high punitive interest rates on them. And secondly, we think that the repayment rate, so the percentage of their income above the threshold that's being paid back, needs to be lower, because that's the thing that's harming work incentives, and giving people really, really high marginal tax rates up to, in the high 70%. So you can have a 77% marginal tax rate if you have a master's and an undergraduate loan and are earning over £100,000. What does that do to our economy if people are really not incentivized to work? So those are the two main things that our campaign is looking to address.
Amazing. And what would you say to students or graduates who feel overwhelmed or powerless by the student loan balance currently?
I mean, I would say I completely get it. My balance makes me feel powerless too. I think really we can't just let this lie. I think The Economist described this whole student loan policy as the politics of least resistance. And what that means is that it's basically the loans are being made worse retrospectively, like Rachel Reeves freezing the Plan 2 threshold from 2027 to 2030 again in the recent budget. They're doing that because they think they can get away with it, and young people aren't necessarily too concerned with it. And I think that's partly because we're all sometimes too afraid to look at our student loan balances. So I think we need to sort of own it, the student loan balances, but then also do something about it and make sure that people know that we're not happy with it.
I remember when I was at school specifically, I would hear things like, it won't stop you getting a mortgage. And that's just not true. Yes, technically, it doesn't attach itself to your credit file, but it does stop you from being able to take as much of a mortgage because it is a deduction on your pay. And do you think that this has led to even more frustration from people that didn't realize what they were signing up to when they signed up?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the classic sort of retorts that people give when we make sort of a big deal about what I think is a really important issue is they say, you knew what you were signing up to, be quiet, just get on with it. But actually, because the loan terms have been retrospectively changed, so there's another example of that with Rachel Reeves again freezing the repayment threshold from 2027 to 2030. Those are not the terms that people signed up to, right? They signed up to terms where they thought the threshold was going to increase with average earnings or inflation, whichever was highest. And having the terms being changed retrospectively, I think is really dangerous. You wouldn't be allowed to do that if you were a bank with someone's mortgage, right? I think there are a few other issues as well. I think lots of young people, when they think back to their time at school, feel like they were told that this was, the best debt that you'd ever get, the best loan that you would ever be able to access, and that you really wouldn't notice the monthly repayments. People have told us that they were told it wouldn't cost them more than a phone contract every month. Yet people are making, really substantial repayments in the hundreds of pounds every month. And therefore, I think that some people really feel that the student loans were missold. I mean, Luke Charters, the Labour MP in the House of Commons last week, said that the communication around Plan 2 interest rates and how they're related to income, he said that that feels like a mis-selling scandal waiting to unfold. That's an MP saying that in the House of Commons. And I think that is a sentiment that a lot of graduates really agree with and feel. And I think onto your point about mortgages, that's another really classic thing that people were told. I think it's not going to affect your credit rating. It's not going to affect your ability to get a mortgage. But obviously, when banks work out whether they want to lend to you, they look at your income, and your effective disposable income is impacted by these student loan repayments, which are taken off your paycheck. And therefore, of course, they're going to impact the bank's perception of your ability to repay.
And then I actually got to interview two other MPs. One was Baroness Bennett. So she used to be leader of the Green Party. Basically, what she had to say is that this should have been free. Can you talk to us from your point of view from the Green Party, how you feel like the student loan has evolved and where you think it went wrong?
Well, it went wrong, first of all, in putting the weight of debt on student shoulders instead of the public good that education delivers being covered by a cost to society. And if people then earn large amounts of money, that being recovered that way, the weight being put on students' shoulders. And what we've seen, of course, is we started off with loans for maintenance grants, then we started off with £1,000 fees and £3,000 fees, £9,000 fees, now more than £9,500 fees. The costs have just gone up and up. For many students trapped with extremely high interest rates, many people building up through the interest rates, just see year after year the amount of money they owe going up, never going down. And so we have a system that's just getting steadily worse and worse, and really more and more of a fantasy, because the reality is that most people will never pay them off. They're not loans in the normal sense in which we understand them.
And obviously, the major thing in the news this week has been the interest. Do you have a particular viewpoint on what that interest really should have been, or if it should even be on student loans?
Well, I mean, we start from the position in the Green Party that education is a public good and the cost should be met by general society and then recovered from taxation from those people who use the degree to earn large amounts of money. So there shouldn't be any student loans at all. If we have to have those student loans, then the RPI is an unreasonable measure, hardly used for anything else at all, and generally higher than more commonly used measures of inflation. And putting extra on top of the RPI is just adding insult to injury. And the fact that we've now seen the repayment period extended to 40 years if you think of someone finishing university in their early 20s, it's essentially their whole working life that weight dragging them down is going to be sitting on their shoulders all through the years when people would normally be thinking about, perhaps buying a house, buying a flat, except if you perhaps live in London. It might be thinking about having children, thinking about building the structures of a life that previous generations have regarded as standard. This is just one more weight with the cost of living crisis, with a real crisis in terms of jobs being available to young people, that's just making the idea of building a life seem understandably almost impossible.
Do you think that student loans as a concept were missold, especially especially in regards to Plan 2? Obviously, we've even seen with the current government where they've frozen the threshold for Plan 2. Do you think that they should be allowed to do that retrospectively?
I think one of the big problems has been that the rules keep changing midstream. And I know, for example, Martin Lewis, the money saving expert, has rightly made a big fuss about this. Is generally considered that you can't change the terms of the contract in middle ground, and yet the government has kept doing that. That's one issue. But the other issue is just the fact that the idea that people, you're 17, you're thinking about which university to apply for, you're thinking about your future life, that you could conceivably be being able to see where you might be in 10 years' time with, at least £50,000 of debt, maybe £100,000 of debt. And, there's more than 150,000 students, former students now with more than £100,000 of debt, 2.6 million people who owe more than £50,000. But when people start as of 17-year-olds starting on their life, it's impossible to be thinking what things might be like in 10 or 20 or indeed 30 years for people facing a 40-year loan term.
Final one from me. So the Green Party has called for reform on student finance. That's not unheard. What would meaningful reform actually look like in practice?
Well, meaningful reform means no student tuition fees. Education is a public good. And if someone takes a university degree, maybe a PhD, and goes into the city and earns fat cat pay levels, enormous amounts of money, then we should be taxing them fairly. They've got broad shoulders that can bear the weight. If someone gets a degree, goes and runs a local community garden, is an absolute centre and stalwart of their community, just makes enough money to see a bit of it trickling away every year into that student loan repayment, but knows they're never going to pay it off, that's a deeply unreasonable, unfair, and damaging for the whole of our society situation.
Thank you. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to the student loan conversation? Because obviously it's very much in the news. The next generation are looking right now at all like social media and the news to find answers to what is going on. What else would you want to add to that?
What I would say is that I don't think we should be framing this as a generational issue. We have many pensioners now living in poverty right now, switching the heating off because they can't afford to pay for the heating, not eating properly because they can't afford the food. The problem we have is between the rich and the rest of us in society. And it's something of a distraction to frame this as a generational issue. We have a deeply and increasingly unequal society that's doing enormous damage to everyone. And we need to rebalance our society so those people who can afford to contribute to a better society for all of us, including themselves, they make the contribution they should be making, and people who need support get the support they need.
And then finally, Lib Dem MP Bobby Dean. I feel a bit bad because I kind of gave him a bit of a hard time. It was like really late on a Friday night when I did this interview. And I basically was a bit miffed with him because he was in the Lib Dem party. And obviously, to me, they raised my student fees. But it's not his fault. I did say to him as well, I was like, when did you go to uni? Because so many adults have been saying like, oh, it's okay, it is what it is. And I'm like, well, did you go in Plan 2? No? Well, stop talking then. Because for those of us that are in Plan 2, that are living it, it feels like a real big problem. But, sorry, back to the point. This is what Bobby Dean had to say about the entire scandal. Can you talk us through, obviously, your feelings around the student loan and where you think things have gone wrong?
Yeah, I think basically it's become a bit of a sort of hidden tax on young people. And by stealth, really, it's changed over time. There was kind of a deal set out a number of years ago when the big reforms first happened, and it's just been changed over time, particularly with things like thresholds. I mean, I think the threshold is around about the same place where London living wage would be now. That was never really the intended purpose. It was meant to represent a graduate wage. And then things like the interest rate, the way it was initially set up was to add 3% onto inflation. But with the recent inflation, that's meant it's really unsustainable for a lot of people and taking large chunks out of people's wages.
And the government often argue that high interest rates are necessary to protect public finances. How would you respond to that?
Well, if it was to truly track inflation, then maybe that would be the case. But the fact that you're adding 3% on top, and also the particular measure of inflation that the government have opted for, all of these things add up to it not really being the case about just merely protecting public finances. I think if people thought it was just going to follow a real inflation rate in order to make sure that the debt doesn't disappear with inflation over time, people would stomach that. But the additional percentage points on top make it quite unsustainable for anybody, really.
What do the Lib Dem party believe when it comes to student loans now, given obviously their involvement in the 2012 changes?
Yeah, I mean, with the 2012 changes, I said, the way that it was set out, on the face of it, it could have been a fairer system if you had the thresholds in the right place, if you had the maintenance loans and maintenance grants in the right place, and if inflation behaved in the way that it was at that time. But I think we now need to look at it all again. I mean, the Lib Dem manifesto last time talked about having a review. I still think that's necessary. We need to get the new system right. And I think we probably should look at education a bit more holistically as well, given that people are going to probably need access to lifelong learning as well. I wonder if there's a way that we can bundle all this in together to have truly sustainable financing options for people. Just one point, the income contingency part is really, really important. And that's what obviously sets it apart. And I think you don't want people to end up like they are in other countries where they're going to get loans from sort of in a typical fashion, a traditional fashion. You want them to still have this income contingency. And I think that's why government's got a role to play. But the rest of it needs fixing.
So do you believe that the current, so obviously you've alluded to it from what you've said, but obviously so you don't believe that the current student loan plan is fair. And obviously when it comes to the fact that, you have to be earning over 66,000 to even be like there to be a possibility of you ever repaying it in full, do you think it's just a completely broken system?
It has become a completely broken system, yeah, particularly with the latest plan. I mean, you're talking 40 years now, I think they're saying, before they're considering writing off. Look, I've not run the numbers, so I don't know what the sustainable solution is, but we do need to look at, is the threshold in the right place? Is the repayment period right? And what are we got to do about that inflation-linked interest rate? Is that in the right place as well? So I think those are the things that we need to look at. Potentially, we need to up the threshold so that it's truly reflective of what a graduate boost should do to your wages. Perhaps we need to look at the write-off period so it's not a burden throughout your entire lifetime. These are sorts of things we need to look at. But I'm not going to come in here and sort of announce this is exactly what we should do because I haven't run the numbers. But I think that's what the government needs to look at.
What would you say to a young person now who feels like the system discourages them from taking risks or buying a home or planning for their future?
I would say I feel for them. I mean, I'm a reasonably youngish person myself, but I know that for the next generation, it's getting even harder. And when this scheme was sort of first sold back in the day, it was kind of said it wouldn't affect your opportunities to get a mortgage and so on, but it is reducing your real income. I mean, large chunks of your wages are being taken away from student loan now. It's not insignificant amounts. And I think, yeah, it is hurting people. I think that young people should be saying to us, politicians, do something about this, please. There's not enough public attention on it. Let's start getting some petitions going on campuses. Let's start having some shouting about it because it is impacting people right now.
Yeah. So on that point, are you planning to do anything about it?
Well, I've got to say, I did see your piece on the news the other day, and it made me think we need to start doing something about this. I spoke with some other younger colleagues in the Lib Dems who feel the same way, feel like it's about time we address this issue. So I'm hoping that something will start soon, and let's see if we can get cross-party agreement on it and build a bit of a movement behind it.
Thank you. Right. I didn't have any more questions, but is there anything specific you would like me to ask you that you have a repayment for? Did you go to university?
Yeah, I went to uni. I was under the plan just before 2012. So yeah, I've got a slightly better deal than most. But I did go back and do a postgraduate about 3 years ago. So I'm feeling the big chunk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was the first year of 2012, so me and
Yeah.
me and Nick Clegg aren't besties.
No, I can understand it. Yeah, I understand it. I mean, I was a student at the time as well, right?
Mhm.
So, but yeah, like I said, I think our party's instincts are in the right place in this, but because of the history of it,
Yeah.
um, it's made it difficult for us to confront. But I think there are younger people in the party like myself now want us to go and say, right, let's stand up and take the stance that's in line with our value on this issue. Let's try and sort it out.
Yeah, nice. Okay. If you could reform one thing on the student loan, what would that one thing be? Because obviously we've mentioned various other things that you think need reform. But what would one start point be for you?
I think the threshold is the bit that I would look at probably first. Um, just because the whole deal of going to university and the reason why you're putting this money in is because you're going to get a return on the investment. And if the threshold's not in the right place, then the deal hasn't really been struck in the right way. So I think that's probably one of the key things I would look at. I think the threshold at the moment is round about the London living wage,
Mm.
which is not the graduate bonus you expected to invest in. So maybe doing something like that. And that would obviously push the universities to offer courses that are going to produce results as well.
Mm. Anything else you want to say, Bobby?
I think that's it.
But the big question I have for you is university still worth it? Would you have gone if you knew that your student loan would be more in 10 years' time than when you took it out? I actually don't know if I would have. I got so much from university, but did I get a lot from my degree? I don't know. I did accountancy and banking at Bangor University in North Wales, and I really enjoyed it, but I think the majority of the enjoyment I had at uni was doing cheer and going on ski holiday or not ski holiday, like this uni ski trip and doing, I don't know, all of the extracurricular stuff that I did at uni. Would I have felt as strongly about going to uni if it had just all been about the degree? Probably not. I won't lie. So it's a real big conversation piece. Like, I also probably would have got in the same place in my career without my degree, although there are some debates, and I'll try and find some research about this, but there are debates still that with a university degree, you do earn more than people without university degrees. Is it fair? Probably not, but it is still the system. So realistically, if someone had said to me, you're going to university, but it means your taxes are going to be 9% higher for the rest of your life, I might have thought twice. And I think that's genuinely what we should be saying to the next generation. Because as I said at one point, the growth of the economy is going to be impacted by this, because people between that 100,000 to 125,000, 140 are seeing, obviously, their personal allowance started being taken away. So there's like a 6% tax trap. You're then adding on student loan to that at 9%. You're seeing so many taxes that for many of them, and especially even when they get to that 45% and higher, they do start to question whether it is worth working those extra hours or earning any more money on the side, because actually such a small percentage of that money will be taken home that what's the point? Some final practical advice for you. One is please go and check how much student loan you have left. Just to be in the know is really important. Check to make sure the repayments you're making are correct. So if you look on your payslip, make sure the plan you're on your payslip is the right one for you. So if you went pre-2012, you probably will be on plan 1. Between 2012 and 23, you're on plan 2. If you went to uni post-23, you're on plan 5. But I can't imagine many of those or anyone that went from 23 is out of uni yet. So important to check. And then finally, if you need to, update your details with the student loans company if things have changed, because you're going to want to know how things are progressing. Oh, and do you know what? The fourth and final one is get behind this campaign. We don't know what it looks like yet. I'm still in conversations with Ollie. I talked about it on LBC. I talked about it on Sky. We're having big conversations about it, but get involved, because if this impacts you, we really should be kicking up a stink about this, because if we want to see change, we have to be talking about it more. So, do you think we were missold student loans? Debate with me below, because I actually think that it's criminal. I think that the situation that we're currently in, where we have huge amounts of debt as well on the interest, or we have £15.2 billion worth of interest alone last year and only £5 billion repaid, should be a bigger headline than it currently is. And it's impacting millions and millions of young people who are already struggling with the cost of living crisis, taxes being or fiscal drag impacting their livelihood, and a lack of jobs. You know, it's not even a guarantee if you go to university anymore that you're going to get a job, which is ridiculous. And I think it's really frustrating and something that we need to be shouting about. So I'm going to stop ranting and hopefully speak to you below. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and start talking about this mis-selling student loan scandal.